Okay, thank you. Welcome, everyone, and thank you all for joining today's virtual lecture hosted by InCHIP. Today, we're really honored to have Dr. Claire Wardle to talk about her recent work on building resilience against misinformation. Dr. Claire Wardle is an associate professor in the Department of Communication at Cornell University. Her research focuses on user-generated content, verification, and misinformation. She has spent the past 2 decades working across sectors, including as academic at different universities in the UK and the US, working with different international news organizations as well as the United Nations, and advising different policymakers. She also co-founded the nonprofit First Draft and Information Future Lab at Brown University. She holds the MA in political science and a PhD in communication from the University of Pennsylvania. Her research focuses on the contemporary information ecosystem and vulnerabilities and opportunities offered through participatory community spaces, both on and offline. Her current work is attempting to understand how more effective responses to community information needs by and with communities might create resilience against misinformation. During today's presentation, the audience will be muted, but please feel free to put your questions in the chat. We will unmute you once the presentation is done, and we'll start the Q&A session then. Without further ado, the floor is yours, Dr. Wardle.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and thank you for having me. I'm really excited for this presentation. So we've got quite a lot to get through, so I'm going to throw up some slides so that we can get going. And as you just heard, a lot of my work is about information ecosystems and really trying to understand the role of communities in all of that. So I'm going to start by, let me just get going with the slides. I'm going to start by basically giving a little bit of an introduction to me and how I got into this space. Then I'm going to talk about building and supporting participatory information environments. Then I'm going to actually go through 4 case studies because I think sometimes that can be really useful. And then I'm going to end, and we're all going to hopefully end feeling very positive about the world, which isn't always the case when we're talking about information ecosystems. So as an introduction, this is kind of a fun, cute way to start presentations, which I tend to do. So enjoy.
Hello. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about a new technology that's affecting famous people. Remember when Obama called Trump a dipshit?
Complete dipshit.
Or the time Kim Kardashian rapped?
Because I'm always half naked.
Or when Arnold Schwarzenegger impersonated himself?
Get out of this, there's a bomb in there. Get out!
Deepfake? Deepfake? Deepfake.
Gotta be kidding.
This is a deepfake too. I'm not Adele, but I am an expert in online manipulation.
So that was actually from 2019, which at the time I thought the world was on fire, but actually in hindsight, I would do anything to go back to 2019. We didn't really understand at that point how AI was going to change everything. The New York Times asked me to write an op-ed. Then they said, can we film you? And I was like, yes. And then they said, can we turn you into Adele? And I was like, yes, you can. And back then, and you can guess, but they paid a deepfake creator $500. And now it wouldn't cost anything. And an 8-year-old could do that in probably 5 minutes. So we live in a very different time from 2019. But that was kind of in the middle of my journey. I wanted to kind of go back to where a lot of this started. And it's kind of incredible to think that the real tragedy on the day after Christmas in 2004, when there was the massive tsunami in Southeast Asia. And at that point, it's hard to imagine, but we would only have seen the wave because people had video cameras. This was before the age of smartphones. And imagine this story if we hadn't actually seen the wave, like we would only have seen the devastation. But we have to realize it's only really been 20 years since we have acknowledged that we can see things that are happening in real time, not just the aftermath. And on the 7th of July, 2005, there was a series of bombings in London on the Underground. And it was the first time that BBC News ever led a bulletin using footage from a camera that wasn't owned by the BBC. It was owned by somebody. This was before the iPhone was invented in 2007. This was kind of a flip phone, but they captured an image from underground. And this was this moment when the BBC recognized that they were shifting into a space where they were going to have to rely on content from the audience. But that, of course, led to challenges. And so in 2008, they asked me to write a report for them on user-generated content, because they recognized there was all of these ways that they could interact with the audience. But I'll be honest, there was some hesitancy about, well, should we be allowing the audience to send us content? Like, what does that mean? We're the gatekeepers. But there was this recognition of, well, we have to do that. But then how do we verify content? And so once this report was published, they asked me to go and work with them for 6 months on a consultancy to help roll out the recommendations, which I'm not going to lie, was very fun and really took my academic work and made me feel like it was connected to the real world. And just as my time there was coming to an end, this happened, which some of you might actually remember. Some of you may have watched the movie with Tom Hanks. But at that time, the head of BBC News Gathering called me up and said, we were scooped by CNN. None of our journalists are on Twitter. They couldn't find this image. So this image was taken by somebody on a ferry. And he was on Twitter and he took this picture. And this BBC head of news gathering said, none of my journalists knew how to find this picture, how to verify this picture. And even if they verified it, they didn't know whether they could use it ethically or legally. So this was the way that I got into this question, which is, how do we know what's true online? And I actually left the academy at that point and started working with different newsrooms and the UN and a startup focused on social media verification. And so everything that I thought about was, how do you tell what's true on the internet? Not really recognizing that it was going to become a thing that absolutely everybody was concerned about. Around 2016, when we had obviously the elections, the Brexit, what was perceived to be a surprise election of Donald Trump, we had Duterte in the Philippines, and this recognition that there were teenagers in Eastern Europe creating fake news websites, and all of a sudden everybody was worried about misinformation. And so around that time, I co-founded an organization called First Draft, where we worked with lots of community groups, government agencies, and newsrooms to help them navigate the challenges of misinformation. And as part of that, we wrote numerous reports. And as you can imagine, many of our reports were focused on democracy, climate, but especially health around COVID. And as you also know, there's many debates right now about even the term misinformation. And I think what I have always tried to focus on is not to play whack-a-mole with individual examples. So whilst it's easy to write a report about, here are the 5 YouTube videos this week that are sharing misinformation, that to me is when it becomes quite troubling. You know, unless it's really, really clear, that's what allows people to push back to say, well, who are you to say that it's misinformation? So a lot of the work that we did at First Draft was focused on narratives. What are the ways that people are talking about something, so that we, and when I say we, I mean journalists, researchers, government agencies, how can we more effectively talk to the public and help them navigate what is a very complex and confusing set of information ecosystems? So how can we listen effectively? And listening means listening for narratives, not just listening for individual examples. So we wrote a report called Under the Surface, where we really identified 6 different core narratives about the ways that people were talking about vaccines. We then did one specifically looking at which narratives were circulating in Spanish-speaking communities. And we also did a similar report around Black communities. And we did many, many, many reports. But what I really wanted to use this as an example to say, we really focused on, how do you listen to communities and how do you listen to the way that they are making sense of the world? Because we can only talk effectively to communities if we are using the same language and if we are tapping into the same stories and frames through which people are understanding the world. So I've always really been focused on communities, but definitely in the last 3 to 4 years, I've tried to reorientate my work to think about, well, how can we deeply listen to what communities need? And once we have done that, we can more effectively meet those needs, rather than sitting around in meeting rooms being like, I know what people need to know, when often there is a disconnect between the ways in which researchers or journalists think about what's necessary versus what it is that people themselves are struggling with. What questions do they have? What are they confused about? Where is there an absence of information? So it's not always, oh, there's false information. It's that there just isn't information. And I would say that too often traditional institutions like universities or large government agencies we don't like to say anything until we're 100% certain. But unfortunately, that kind of worked in 1996 when we had kind of an information ecosystem that there were fewer gatekeepers, there were fewer outlets for information. Now, if there is an absence from people who were previously really trusted, what that means is that those vacuums get filled by people who don't necessarily have the best interests of the community at heart. Sometimes they do, but sometimes they don't necessarily have the highest quality information. So it's about people's questions and concerns and where there's absences of information. And this, I did quite a lot of work around the term information disorder. And at the time, I came up with this Venn diagram where I was trying to say, well, it's really important that we dissect what's misinformation, what's disinformation, what's malinformation. And I created these typologies and I did all these trainings. Then a couple of years ago, I wrote this piece, basically throwing my hands up and saying, I think some of what I said was wrong. I said, you can see at the end of this paragraph, these terms, especially the first two, mis and disinformation, have caught on, but they represent an overly simple, tidy framework I no longer find useful. And that's because I think there's been this disproportionate focus on the content and a disproportionate focus on, well, what is the content and like what was the intent? And if we can just play whack-a-mole with that, then we're going to solve everything. When actually I think about this as a kind of an iceberg, which is, headline writers, conference organizers, funders, they've loved to focus on these terms, misinformation and conspiracies. That drives traffic, it drives money, it drives all these things. But actually, it also helps institutions, and I say that as somebody who is in a large institution. Research universities are part of the problem too, is that we are not very good at communicating. Right. So what we tend to do is to think, well, we're not the problem. It's the bad actors. It's those, trolls online. It's the disinformation operatives. They're the ones causing all the problems. If only people would listen to us. And the truth is that we don't always communicate effectively. We don't really communicate where people are spending time, using messengers that people trust, using formats that make sense to people. And we often don't use language that makes sense to people either. And we mostly don't actually respond to people's questions and concerns. We tend to have this sense of, well, I did this research. Let me tell everybody about it. Well, is that actually meeting communities' information needs? And so it's really been a shift in my own work to say, well, how can we listen effectively to people's questions and concerns to ensure that we're actually responding to those questions and concerns and responding in places where people are asking those questions and sharing their concerns? And are we doing it with the best messengers? So, when I'm listening online, people often have really valid questions. This morning I just went and looked for a couple of examples. Do I need a booster shot? They're asking about shingles. They've got very valid questions. Another person, I don't know whether I should get I got my COVID shot on October 21st. If I get the flu one in late November, is that long enough apart? There's lots of discussions now about whether or not you should get your vaccines, flu and COVID on the same day. There's new research that suggests maybe not. Those of us in the scientific community are like, well, that's one study. It needs to be replicated. But if I'm somebody who doesn't necessarily read science, I'm like, well, I saw somebody said that there's new paper. Should I listen to it? We're not very good at communicating science and the uncertainty of science and what we should be listening to and what we should be taking recommendations over. On Reddit, for example, are there negative consequences for taking birth control? There's now all sorts of questions and confusion about birth control and its safety. We're seeing many, many young women now coming off birth control, not because they've necessarily talked to their doctor, but because they've seen lots of things on TikTok and Instagram. Also, we're seeing the same about sunscreens. Is it dangerous, harmful? We're also seeing it around statins. People have really valid questions. And if we just say, oh, if you think this, then it's misinformation. Well, no, let's talk about what's in sunscreens. Let's talk about why people are concerned. Let's talk about the fact that in different countries, there are different ingredients, right? We can't ignore the fact that people have really valid questions. So a lot of what I talk about is let's stop really focusing on overt misinformation. Let's listen to people, understand their questions and concerns, listen to the ways that people are talking about this, understand the stories that they're telling to one another, listen to people's first person experiences and not dismiss that and just say, well, it's not a randomly controlled trial, so it doesn't matter, right? So much of this is really about listening to communities. And so from a theoretical framework, there's really good work here, both in the news journalism studies, environment. But I really like this study by Watson and Kavanagh, a theory and methodological framework for doing community information needs assessments. One of the reasons I love this paper is they talk deeply about connecting with universities and finding a way that we can find students or, make students understand their local community information needs, and to really think about that model of students going out and effectively listening to communities in person as well as online. So the second part of my presentation, I hope you can see now kind of where my passion is and the ways that I think about things. But I want to think a little bit here about how to build and support participatory information environments. So I use this slide a lot in presentations, and it's not showing throwing shade on the Australian Government Department of Health, because I really could have taken any Department of Health and shown this. This is from before the pandemic, I have to be clear, and it was well, I say pamphlet, but it was over a 50-page document. It's a PDF, which universities love, government agencies love. We love a PDF and we love text. And so this is a document that has not one image in it. It's all text and it's very, very dry, right? There is nothing factually incorrect here. Everything is incredibly scientific and proven and evidence-based. But what does it do when it is juxtaposed against people who are trying to share information about vaccines, who are using much more visual formats, much more simple formats, much more shareable formats, and much more emotive formats, right? And I'm not saying the Department of Health should start creating memes, but what I'm saying is, where's the middle ground where there is a recognition that those of us who are trying to communicate effectively recognize that we need to be more visual, we need to be more story-based, we need to think about emotion. And emotion doesn't have to be shocking, but emotion means that you have to feel something, because that is how humans respond to information. There's a sense that as humans, we all have a rational relationship to information. We have an emotional relationship to information. That doesn't matter how educated you are, who you vote for, how old you are. It's a very human feeling to want to feel something. And so if I see a news article and it's full of data and it's full of facts, I'm less likely to share that, because what am I giving to somebody else? I want to give a feeling, whereas something like this makes people automatically have an emotional response to it, right? And this isn't misinformation. It is a different way of sharing information. We might not like it, those of us who support vaccines, but we have to recognize how effective this is as a communication tool. And so when we think about the differences between universities, government agencies, journalists, on the left-hand side, that is top-down linear communication with traditional ideas about expertise that tends to be built on, well, how many letters do you have after your name? The way that we communicate is based on the deficit model. If only we had more facts, everything would be okay. There's very few, if any, feedback loops, and our communication tends to be text-based and distanced and objective, right? We never want ourselves to be in there. We never want to tell stories. The other side, and I don't like to use that phrase, but as somebody who spends a lot of time in online communities, what they are participatory, dynamic. They're not hierarchical. Online has a role to play. They have a voice. They're told to do their own research because everybody has a role to play. And your expertise comes from experience. So when people are told, well, share your experiences, it's because that is valued as expertise, right? Expertise isn't necessarily about, in fact, it's more often than not the number of letters you have after your name. It's, well, are you a mother with a child that has had RSV? Tell me your story on TikTok so that I can compare my own experiences with you. That's how people are communicating. And because of that, they feel like they're part of a community that values them, and they feel like they have agency. And these communities are two-way information flows, their story. And so I think everybody here knows this, right? I'm not telling you anything new, but I think when you really think about the difference between traditional communication techniques versus those that are circulating in online communities, we can see that difference. And one of the reasons that I get kind of frustrated by all of this is that when I was doing early work with the BBC, but in the early 2000s, they were doing really interesting participatory work. They had this thing called ICANN. It was all about creating online communities where you could be part of something, publicize an event, learn something, meet people, share experiences and expertise, get a campaign going. That was happening. They did this amazing project in Wales where They would go to mining towns. So Wales used to have lots of mining, and that was destroyed in the 80s and 90s. And so there were many communities in Wales where people felt really disenfranchised, didn't trust the BBC because of their coverage of the strikes that had happened around the mining shutdown. And the BBC went into their communities, and they would arrive on a Monday and tell some of these ex-miners to come to the community centre with shoe boxes full of photographs. And in a week, they would train these ex-miners to tell their own stories, how to write a script, and how to create a short video where they could tell their own stories, these digital stories. And those digital stories were then played on BBC television, right? And what it did for those communities was to make people feel heard, felt valued, it developed skills. They felt like they had a really important role to play, and it changed their relationship with the BBC. And finally, this is an example I love. It was from BBC Bristol, which is in the west of the country, and a local radio station announced that there was a new mayor coming. So in the UK, you can be a carpetbagger, essentially. You can be elected even though if you're not from there. And so they said, right, there's a new mayor. She doesn't know anything about Bristol. Let's show her the best bits of Bristol. Upload your photos to Flickr. Some of you might remember Flickr. And people thought that they were going to upload pictures of the suspension bridge and the balloon festival and sunrises. And of course, no, they uploaded pictures of dog poo, mattresses, and uncollected garbage. But what the mayor did was she saw all of these and she made sure that all of these problems were solved. And so people were like, what? Actually, I'm being listened to. And they continued to post and she continued to solve. And it was this incredible moment of like, yeah, this is what it's about. And when I interviewed people in Bristol, they said, yeah, the BBC asks us all the time, tell us what you think, leave a comment. And these people in Bristol said, they're not reading our comments. They don't actually care what I think. They're not really going to do anything about it. But this mayor, she did listen and she did do something about it. And that it wasn't just user-generated content for the sake of it. There was actually a two-way process happening. And so when you spend time in these communities, people are sharing their stories with one another. These are people sharing their vaccine injuries, case studies with each other. They are being listened to, they are being heard. And if you spend time in these communities, they're like, why is nobody listening to our stories? We're not lying. And when all we're asking for is that people listen to our stories, and we're being completely ignored by the mainstream media. But people here feel heard. And so I think all the time about people in Bristol feeling heard and so many people not feeling heard, people in the long COVID community, people in the Lyme disease community, people who have had vaccine injuries, right? Like we don't want to talk about it because we're so scared about what that's going to do. But what that means is that we're not listening. And as a result, people feel ignored and they feel like they're being trampled on. And so there was some research that was done in the Harvard Kennedy School Misinformation review. And it was about a conspiracy newspaper in the UK called The Light that was very popular during COVID. And they basically did a content analysis of The Light, which was what they call a truth paper. And what they said really resonated. Our findings also echo recent work suggesting contemporary forms of conspiracy theory can be participatory, with those involved not simply passive receptors of inaccurate or misleading information, but involved in a process of research and discovery, becoming actively involved in the conspiracy theory itself. So I hope that what you can see from this section of my talk here is that there are ways that what previously known as trusted institutions, whether that's universities, government agencies, newsrooms, how can we find ways to recreate these feelings that some of these conspiratorial and disinformation communities feel? And so that's really what I want us to focus on, which is rather than just saying, oh, it's bad actors, make them go away, how can we truly listen to people? But through that listening, listen to what is being said and really think about ways to respond to people's concerns and confusions. So just one example I'm going to leave you with before I go to the next section is you may remember that there was a time when people started talking about myocarditis. There was this concern that vaccinating young boys, like 9 to 10-year-olds, with the COVID vaccine was leading to myocarditis. Now, when that happened, the CDC did not have enough data. And so, repeating what I said in the introduction, they didn't respond for over 3 weeks. And in that time, that vacuum was filled with people who wanted to push the idea that the COVID vaccine was not safe. And so they were responding to people on Twitter and on other social media platforms. They were doing the effective listening, and they were responding to mothers saying, hey, I just asking, like, I've heard about myocarditis. I don't know what I should do. And they had really valid concerns, and they were targeted by people who were trying to push the idea that the vaccine was not safe. And, there would be people who might be listening to me now saying, what does she know? She doesn't understand the vaccine is unsafe, right? So we have to recognize that there are people who think very differently about vaccines. And it's only by listening to one another, it's not going to solve our problems, but we're not getting any closer to one another by not listening to people who have valid concerns and they want answers. So I'm going to talk about 4 case studies here where I think that there is some interesting work happening. Some of them are my own, and I'm not saying that they're the answers, but I can talk about those projects and what we've learned. But this is one that has always really inspired me, and some of you might know about it. It's called HARE, the Health Advocates in Reach and Research campaign from the Maryland Center for Health Equity. They have done miraculous work by basically working with barbershop owners and salons around the country to train these people up to be trusted messengers. And it's run by the most incredible human being that you're going to hear from, who I love. This is just a short 3-minute video where he explains the work that they've been doing.
Hello, my name is Dr. Stephen Thomas. I'm a professor in the Department of Health Policy and Management at the University of Maryland School of Public Health, where I direct the Maryland Center for Health Equity. For the past 15 years, we've been conducting research on the role of barbershops and beauty salons in addressing chronic disease, preventable diseases in the African American community. The program is called HARE, Health Advocates in Reach and Research, reaching within the barber stylist community to train them, to get them to a point where they can become certified community health workers, and research to help actually improve attitudes and beliefs towards participation in biomedical clinical trials. And we've been working to make sure that the barbershops and salons could actually be transformed into COVID vaccination sites. And we've been able to successfully, literally deliver vaccines into the arms of people who otherwise would not be vaccinated. There are 3 takeaways from our experience so far. Number 1, misinformation is real. We've got a real problem on our hands. And that problem can be solved by making sure that settings like barbershops and beauty salons are not super spreaders of conspiracy theories, that they're actually places where you can get accurate information, clinical services, and most importantly, an opportunity to rebuild the relationship between minority communities and healthcare delivery systems. Number 2, meet people where they are. You have to listen to their concerns. Hesitancy does not mean never. By listening to their concerns, treating them with dignity and respect, we can move them from hesitancy to vaccine confidence. And thirdly, trust matters. It's not just the message, but it's also the messenger. Barbers and stylists are highly trusted people, and they're trustworthy. By having them as partners in this effort, we can really move the needle and save lives. And we believe as people get information and the knowledge they need, they will naturally gravitate towards saving their own lives and the lives of their family and loved ones. And at the end of the day, that's what this is all about, protecting people one by one, in our case, in the barber and salon chair.
Yes, son, you're fully vaccinated.
So I love Stephen Thomas so much. And if he was on this webinar, what he would say, he'd be really honest, was that he got all of this money during COVID and did all of this miraculous work. But subsequently, the money has dried up from COVID. And many of the communities that he works with have said, hey, listen, we still have health issues. We still have high cholesterol. We still have a number of other diabetes issues that concern our community. And the money has dried up. And we train these people and they're ready, but nobody cares about our community anymore, right? So there's also the damage here of doing this kind of work and then disappearing. And Stephen Thomas talks really eloquently about if we can't be consistent and show up for communities, then we really have to think about when we do it in the first place. And so his message really resonates with me about how, if we do these kind of community interventions, how can we ensure that we can sustain them? So I'm going to talk about another project that I was inspired by called iHeard, which is based in St. Louis. And the idea with iHeard is that they basically have a number of people in the St. Louis community that they survey to get a sense of what are the questions and concerns and rumors that are circulating in St. Louis. And then on this dashboard, they basically say, well, this is what people are concerned about at the moment. And so when I did this screenshot from August, I have to say I'm a bit worried. This doesn't seem to have been updated recently. So I suspect that maybe they have been a victim of some of the funding challenges. But back in August, the kind of health claims were national childhood vaccination rates are lower this year, or you may not need 10,000 steps a day to lower your risk of chronic disease. So they come up with the things that their survey responders have been saying that they've been hearing. And then they also say, well, if you hear this, here's some language that you can use to talk to people who are sharing these things. So it's not just, oh, here's what's, here are the rumors that are circulating in our community. It's saying, these are the things that we're hearing circulating, and here's some of the ways that you can gently push back, or you can talk to people about it. So I love this idea of both kind of longitudinally capturing the kind of problems and questions and concerns people have, but also having a way of responding to it. And it has been independently evaluated as a project. And they really found, and you can see the conclusions on the right, our first year experience suggests that this systematic community-based approach to assessing and addressing misinformation is feasible, sustainable, and a promising strategy responding to the threat of health misinformation. It might not be sustainable if the funding has gone away, but I've really always been drawn to iHeard as this really interesting model of listening to communities. And it was really the inspiration for a project that I worked on with my colleagues when I was at Brown University at the Information Futures Lab. And we partnered with a local organization to basically understand what was happening in Spanish-speaking diaspora communities in South Florida. So it was a pilot to understand whether we could build a networked communications infrastructure for Spanish-speaking diaspora communities in South Florida. And we were asking, can non-traditional community leaders, so as we just saw with the hair barbershop, they're not necessarily traditional community leaders, but as Dr. Stephen Thomas says, they are really trusted. So we also wanted to test, are these people who can really work effectively within communities to stop misinformation and to answer questions? And we also wanted to understand whether they could play a role in co-creating and disseminating information to answer those questions. So we partnered with We Are Mass, which are a community group down in Miami, and they helped identify what we called information navigators. So some of them were more traditional, we might say, teachers, librarians, journalists, but we also had somebody who had his own construction company. We had a hairdresser. We had somebody who was the receptionist at the local doctor's clinic. We had somebody who was on the front desk of the YWCA. So we had these different information navigators. And what was so interesting is when we said to them, well, what communities do you represent? They listed all sorts of communities, right? So when we say, are you a community leader? That doesn't necessarily make sense to people because they see themselves as overlapping in the communities that they spend time in. And so basically each week on a Sunday, we would send out a link to a survey on WhatsApp where we asked 3 questions. And then on the Monday, we would research those questions. We'd come up with answers. We'd send them to the local experts to say, are we correct here? And then we'd respond, we'd translate the responses and then share them back out to the information navigators. And then the information navigators would take that content and disseminate it more broadly. So I'll show you a bit of the specifics. We had these questions. We said, what questions, this is what we would send out on a Sunday. What questions are you hearing people in your community ask regarding their health and safety? What other topics are you hearing people ask questions about? What rumors are people sharing about health and safety? And what are they sharing about other topics? So we were trying to get at both the questions and concerns people had, as well as the rumors. And we got all sorts of questions. Some of them were very specific, like, I'm underinsured in Broward County. Do I need a mammogram? To, oh, I've heard that there's a Listerine outbreak in the lettuce. Should I be buying lettuce? To, should I buy a gun? Do you think are my kids safe in school? Why does it keep raining in Miami? I mean, it was just this huge swathe of questions and concerns that people had. And it was kind of amazing when we'd be like, oh, surely we can just Google this. And we would Google these questions and there were not clear answers, and the answers were definitely not available in Spanish. So it was quite clear that actually what we were doing was tapping into something that people needed. I'm not going to play that. And so when we did the evaluation, what we found was that of all of the things that came through our survey, 47% of the responses were concerns, 34% of the responses were questions, and only 19% were rumors. And so if we go back to my iceberg analogy, it kind of makes sense, right? Yes, there was misinformation circulating, but actually the bigger challenge was people's really valid questions and concerns that they couldn't find answers to, that they trusted. And so this project really made me think differently about some of the work that I was doing, and really made me shift away from a very narrow focus on misinformation to think much more broadly. And when we looked at the types of questions people had, a lot of it was about safety and crime, domestic issues, economy, politics, health, tech and media, climate. Like, it really ran the whole gamut, which again, we were very surprised about. And so this was the kind of content we would send back, because we were sending it back so that it worked on WhatsApp. We tried to use emojis. As you can see, we translated content. We did little short videos teaching people things like how to do a reverse image search. And we really tried to make it accessible. I still think we use too many words. It's actually really hard to communicate with fewer words, but we learned so much in the process about doing this. And so we created a lot of these assets, 70 unique WhatsApp messages, newsletters, audio messages, video messages. It was a very busy 6 weeks. But what we found in the evaluation is that those 25 information navigators found that they were better placed to help their communities. They felt like they were given the information that they could then translate, not linguistically, but translate using words or using examples that made sense to their own communities that they were talking to. And again, on a scale of 1 to 5, people said that they felt that it helped them better communicate. It was more culturally appropriate than most of the other available sources. And they felt comfortable passing along the information that we had created. And of course, we didn't have the Brown University logo on. Like, we were nowhere to be seen. This was all about giving the information navigators information to help their communities. And just finally, this was a quote from the evaluation that has stuck with me. The person at the front desk of the YWCA said, "I like to think the YWCA is serving its community, but every Sunday when you sent the survey, I realized that I didn't actually know what questions my community was asking or their concerns. This project caused us to retrain our frontline staff to ask." So to me, this was this moment of, often I'm somebody who ran my own nonprofit. We often think, oh yeah, we're in community, we're part of the community. But that doesn't necessarily mean that even we are listening effectively to our community. And so I think it goes back to, well, what are the ways? Do we have enough town halls? Do we make sure we're reading the comments on Facebook? Do we make sure that we're sending out regular surveys? Are we just stopping to listen to people in the library? Like, all of this to me is just a reminder of, like, are we actually deeply listening? And are we helping people understand that we are hearing them? We're not just listening. And so the final case study is a project that's ongoing right now, and it's about tracking malaria vaccine rumors in Cameroon via health community worker surveys. So building on the work that we did in South Florida, some colleagues thought about this and said, well, in Cameroon, they're one of the first countries in Africa to see a rollout of the new malaria vaccine. But of course, now any new vaccine is becoming part of all of the existing narratives around the COVID vaccine and other vaccines that, there were huge problems with previous vaccines that we've seen in other countries. And so all of this has become kind of combined. And so everybody was really worried about what would happen in Cameroon. And so we worked with people on the ground there to say, okay, what maybe can we help Cameroon now? And it might teach us something, because this vaccine is going to be rolled out in different countries across Africa. So we recruited 60 health community workers in Cameroon. And we basically wanted to get some sense from them of what's the awareness of the malaria vaccine. And so what we found was, 61%, some people know about the vaccine, but not everybody knew about the vaccine. And so even just having an awareness that it was coming, they didn't necessarily know all the specifics, like there's 4 different doses. I mean, it's a very complex vaccine, which doesn't help when you're trying to communicate effectively. And we don't just have community health workers, actually, because we ended up getting a little bit more money. And so we've also been able to add some nurses, public health physician, a midwife, pediatrician. So we're also trying to get a sense of what different types of health providers are hearing. And it's across the country. And it's been really fascinating. We're still in the field, but we're sending out surveys every single week. And what we're finding is that these, as you can probably read, types of rumors that we're encountering, people think that it's going to make the population infertile, which is a classic vaccine rumor in many, many, many parts of the world. And then there's fear of the effects of the vaccine, belief that it's still in the experimental stage, it's ineffective, it's actually about spreading new diseases, worried about side effects, about reducing the population. It's about Cameroon being experimental vaccine, that they're guinea pigs. I mean, these are rumors that we have seen many, many times in many different countries with the rollout of new vaccines. And what we've actually seen is, even though we are surveying every single week, the same rumors are being shared every single week. So what this tells us is that, you know what, we could have been ahead of the curve, and we could have gone in 1 to 2 years ago to Cameroon and done pre-bunking and actually said, you are going to hear these rumors. These are the rumors that come around all the time. Like, let's show you why these rumors are so, powerful. This is why your brain is really persuaded by these narratives. If we had done that, we would be better off now than trying to play whack-a-mole with any particular rumor. So this has kind of taught us that whilst we're doing week-to-week surveys, we're finding almost the same information every single time. And so just to wrap up here, a piece of an article that I had published earlier this year with my colleague David Scales was really trying to think differently about the way that we do surveillance. And I'm using bunny ears because that term is deeply problematic. It works in the public health space. It does not work when we're talking about information. But if we think about the integrated disease surveillance system that is obviously part of epidemiology, it's a kind of a multi-tiered or multi-layered approach, which is indicator-based surveillance, like the laboratory confirmed cases, animal deaths, like what can we actually count in terms of if we have a concern about a new outbreak. But that is mixed alongside event-based surveillance. So what are people searching for on Google? What are their local news reports about? Like, is there sudden absenteeism because fewer people are turning up to work? As well as what's called community-based surveillance, where there are people in communities who are tasked with kind of reporting things that they're seeing that might help the authorities know that there's been a real outbreak. And no one of these kind of data sets is taken as enough. It's about layering in these different data sets together. And from that, then the response is agreed. And when we think about information surveillance, again, I'm using bunny ears, we see too many health agencies using social listening. Like, how many people have you heard saying, oh, we've set up dashboards and we're listening to what people are saying on social media, and that's going to tell us about rumors. But it doesn't tell us whether actually the community are noticing that, and whether the community are worried about that, and whether the community is taking action based on those rumors. So we're actually missing so many of the other parts of the surveillance system that we should be doing. So with Dave, we basically came up with what we call the Community Integrated Information Monitoring and Response System. A bit of a mouthful, but it's about thinking about different layers. So what would it look like to do longitudinal attitude and behavior tracking, right? There's some of that happening, but it's not always connected to information. So that, watching whether childhood vaccination rates are going down, that gives us a longitudinal sense of whether or not there might be impacts. Or, for example, are more people calling poison control about drinking bleach after maybe somebody gives a presentation saying bleach can cure COVID? Like, actually trying to have some of those indicator-based surveillance sets. And then obviously having community-informed information ecosystem monitoring. So some of the things I've just shown you with iHeard, or what we're doing in Cameroon and what we did in South Florida. But then also really having community participation and response, right? So this isn't about people at a university saying, oh, we're going to create some content for WhatsApp. It has to be co-developed with communities. It has to be the Dr. Thomas model of working with salon owners to train them up and say, you go ahead now, like, you talk to your customers in the way that you know that they're going to be able to make sense of this issue. And all of this has to be with the community at the very center. So it's not easy, but what we're advocating for is really thinking about a more connected way of thinking about monitoring for information harms and ensuring that the community is part of the response. And so I just want to close with a couple of things that have resonated. This one very, very recently. So this is from earlier this month. This is a friend of mine, Craig Spencer, who is still at the Brown School of Public Health. And he sent me a text saying, Claire, I'm off to Austin. I'm going to the Children's Health Defense Conference in Austin, Texas. And I was like, sorry? And some of you might know the Children's Health Defense is a nonprofit that was set up by RFK Jr. And I was like, how come you're going? And he's like, I just want to listen. I just want to listen. I'm not saying anything. I just want to listen. And as he was at the conference, he kept texting me being like, Claire, this is unbelievable. You should be here. That we've just done such a terrible job. And so then he came back and wrote this piece for Stat saying, I went to this conference, more of my colleagues should too. And then in response to this, one of the people who went to the conference basically wrote this piece on Substack saying, this physician came to our conference and he watched us like an anthropologist would come like peering at us through a microscope. And she kind of pulled out some of Craig's quotes and was really dismissive and was like, how dare he come here and like treat us with such disdain. And so then Craig responded to her Substack in the comments and said, I just want to say, I think this is a great article. I actually think we've got more in common than you think. And she responded immediately and was like, I don't think we do, but you're a good sport for reading my article and like, let's have a chat. Anyway, they chatted a couple of days ago on Zoom, and she then just posted a piece yesterday saying, I met a Fauci fanboy and I adore him. Right now, just the most incredible, it's partly because Craig is an amazing guy. But what it says is that he went to a place, he listened, and he listened with empathy, and it hasn't changed anybody's minds, but he has started a conversation with somebody who previously thought that he was awful, right? And so to me, is like, how can we find other opportunities to do that? And this is a very simple, but this is an example from 2021 that I almost end every presentation with because it's so good. And so on the left-hand side, this is Nicki Minaj in 2021 saying that she's not going to go to the Met Ball because they're forcing her to get vaccinated. And she said, I'll go once I've done my own research. And Kevin Kruse, who's a historian and somewhat snarky on Twitter, replied, your own research? Do you have a team of scientists running clinical trials out of a spare bedroom? Classic, snarky. You cannot use the word elite, but it wasn't a helpful response. And instead, on the right-hand side, we have Kizzy Corbett, who was actually one of the scientists who helped develop the Moderna vaccine. And she replies, I empathize with this sentiment. I want every single person to get vaccinated out of their own informed will. And I'm here if you ever want to chat, or I can be your Met date, haha, right? Now, what's so brilliant about this is that she starts from a position of saying, I empathize. She doesn't say you're wrong. She doesn't say you're stupid. She says, I empathize. And then, more importantly, she says, I want you to make the decision yourself. She's not saying, trust me. She doesn't say, I designed the vaccine. She's saying, I want you to get vaccinated because you have decided to do so. This is just a classic messaging strategy. I don't think she even thought about it in that way. She's clearly a wonderful human being who just automatically knew how to talk to somebody who was hesitant about getting the vaccine. And so when I talk about building resilience, so much of it is about how do we as communicators, how do those of us who are universities or in newsrooms or government agencies, how do we think differently about the work that we do and how we communicate and how we think about others and others who don't necessarily think that we have anything of value right now in this moment. So thank you very much for listening. And I think we have about 15 more minutes for questions. So I'll stop my screen share.
Thank you, Claire. What a wonderful talk. It's so timely. I just posted on chat that CDC actually just upped their website saying that the vaccine do not cause autism, is not evidence-based. But yeah, I think I'm troubled with this statement and I'm worried about how this will impact the public health. And we can talk about it later, but I want to open the floor for the audience first. Okay, so if you have a question, please raise your hand and you're able to unmute yourself. Suresh, please.
Hi, wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. Learned a lot. And I was nodding with every comment that you were making in terms of listening directly and more deeply with communities. One thing that stood out to me was this idea of information navigators, which is similar to, but so much better than the term of opinion leaders that we tend to use in communication, or even what we see in social media spaces as health influencers, for instance, or news influencers. So this idea of somebody who can navigate the information environment without the inherent power asymmetry there, of being the leader versus, actually listening to people who might have those concerns really stood out to me. So thank you. I wanted to see if you had any more thoughts about that, but that was one of the things that really stood out.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that comment. And I mean, we thought hard about the term, and I don't know whether it will stick, but I often, when people say, they come to me with some false belief, I often say, look, I study this stuff and I often struggle. Like maybe together we can try and figure this out, right? And like, this is what I'm seeing when I search, like, what are you seeing? And so to me, it felt like this idea of like navigating together. And you're absolutely right about the power dynamics. I think we've moved away from that terrible idea at the beginning of COVID, which is if only we could get Taylor Swift to get vaccinated on screen, everybody would get vaccinated. Like influence works in very many different ways. And for many decisions that people are making every single day, they want to look to somebody who is like them, right? You might trust Kim Kardashian for her skincare regime, but I mean, that's for a particular thing. Most people who have questions about their own and their family's health and well-being are looking to conversations at the school gate or they're talking to the person cutting their hair. I mean, we trust the person who cuts our hair more than anything because we don't want to look like idiots. So I think you're absolutely right, which is about who can we train up to have enough information to help somebody make the decisions by themselves, right? Because it's never about influencing somebody to make this decision. It's saying it has to be on your terms, like Kizzy Corbett did at the end. So thank you for that comment.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, please.
Oh, did you call on me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Hi, Claire. I remember you from Brown. I was at Brown for a long time. Yeah, so I have two related questions. So I'm very active on social media. I comment a lot on news stories and things that I see that are misinformation. And there's a couple things I struggle with. One is, do we identify ourselves like as a scientist, as a nutritionist, as, is that helpful or not? And secondly, on how to do that where you're not trying to sound like you're an elitist, whatever. And then secondly, there's also a lot of just bots out there, right? There's like trolls that really, and they'll make up stories about some anecdote that is not even true just for rage baiting and to get comments and likes. And sometimes I can tell that they're trolls, but I don't want to be like arguing with a troll, right? So just wondering how you navigate some of those kinds of things.
Yeah, so thanks so much for bringing this back to, I think for many of us, we have very personal experiences. The first thing I'll say to everybody is there's really good work by Letitia Bode and others about exactly what you're talking about, Kim, which is called the bystander effect, which is when you do what you're doing, when you comment underneath, you're often not going to change the mind of the original poster. But what you are tending to do is to help people who are lurking. Right. So the classic kind of internet studies rule of the 1990s was the 1-9-90 rule. Like there'll be one person posting, 9 people responding, but 90 people lurking. And now that 90 has gone up into the thousands. And so I always say to people, don't think that it's not worth your time doing that commenting because you are helping. Your question about should we say who we are is a really interesting one. And I'm not saying that this is evidence-based, but from other work that I've done, I often think to myself, don't say, well, I'm an expert in, therefore trust me. But I might say, as a nutritionist, I have helped thousands of families think about what they put for their food on their table, right? Like, so you're using the language of experience rather than learned expertise, right? So yes, you are a nutritionist, but I think too often we can use those labels, which is the stand-in. It used to be the stand-in for like, trust me, because I've done a lot of science. But now I often find that you have to say, well, I've done this with many, many people. And over the years, this is what I've seen, right? So the irony is we're kind of thinking about science as a slightly different way. The bots question is a real one. And I think, often there is this idea of doing the usual checks. Like, often I'll see something and I'll get mad and I'll check and they've got 240 followers. And I'm like, you're either a bot or, to be fair, you're not getting much traction. And as we all know, when we reply, we're giving a cue to the algorithm to say this is valuable. Right. So ignoring isn't just I'm ignoring the person or the bot. We're saying to the algorithm, ignore this person. Don't show this to anybody else. So I often say if we are going to have public discussions, even if we're thinking that we're doing it for the rest of the community, there's also this sense of like, well, it's a bit like when we quote tweet, like your point about rage bait. Often you'll see people be like, quote tweeting the bad content, like, I can't believe this. And you're like, ugh, you just put this out in front of more eyeballs, right? You should just have like stepped away from the computer for 5 minutes. So you're absolutely right to be really thoughtful about this. And I think where possible, only really have those debates when it's either somebody that you know, and also I think some like on Facebook, sometimes with family members and others, it's easier to respond to somebody when you're like, Bob is not going to take this well, however polite I am, right? Or like, oh, Carol, maybe if I frame this in a nice way, I think maybe she maybe can move, right? So it's easier when we do this with people that we know than complete strangers on X. So yeah, I hope that's a little bit helpful.
Yes, thank you.
Any other question? Oh, yes. Please, Sugita?
Yeah, can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your talk. I'm an undergraduate student, and I was especially drawn to the talk because I'm interested in doing some community-based service. And I wanted to ask you specifically how you made sure that when you're interacting with communities, you're making your answers and any communications that you're doing culturally relevant and in language or wording that's accessible for community members. Because something I worry about is kind of coming across in a way that doesn't get information to actually mean something to community members, especially when trying to communicate health related information. So,
yeah, that's such a great question. And I love that you're thinking about doing this work. And I really hope that you do, because we need more brilliant people doing this work. But as you're also noticing, there's this challenge. Particularly, there are many of us in universities who have gone into communities and done so in a really extractive way. And we know that, often have gone into communities, and the community knows because they've seen the headline on the university website that you've just received a $2 million grant, and you parachute into a community and you're like, here's a $25 Amazon gift card for my focus group. Thanks, bye. Never go back, never share the findings, deeply problematic. And Stephen Thomas talks very powerfully about that. So with this work, for me, it's always about, I'm probably the last person people want to hear from. So who can I find in the community who is trusted, and how can I really partner, not just for, so I have somebody else on the website who it will get me into a community, but really partner, like, this is what I know. Here's all the things I don't know. There's so much that Is there a way that we can partner here to help the community? And also, I like to do this at the beginning to work with the community, like, what should the research question be? Right? There's too many university researchers who think they know what the research question should be, and then they go and partner. So much of this is going as far back as possible and then really getting out of the way and really making this led by the community and bringing the expertise when I can. But so much of it should be about being co-designed and co-run. And to your point, things around language, cultural relevancy, making sure that we're not being offensive. I mean, there's so many things, even if we're being well-meaning. So yeah, I think there's much more awareness of that now in the academy than 20 years ago, when I think it was too much of it was deeply problematic. Even probably 10 years ago, 5 years ago, was deeply problematic. So that's good, but we still need many, many, many good people doing this work and rebuilding trust with communities that we've lost their trust. Universities have lost a lot of trust over the years, even before the last year, of doing exactly what I was saying, of being extractive and not going back and sharing results. So I hope you do amazing work, and yeah, I'm excited.
thank you.
Any other questions from the audience? I have one. So as researchers, communication researchers, we often just do conventional research like a survey and a focus groups, right? So what would be some creative or participatory methods that you think would be useful or effective to listen to the community?
Yeah, so I love this question. I think it's about thinking where is the community showing up already, and going there and becoming part of those community sessions, right? So there's always community events, and like one thing I like to do is like to take an iPad, and then I've got like an old school telephone that connects to the iPad and so people at these like events, like I have questions, but they can go and talk. There's not like, oh, here are my survey questions. It's like, hey, like, here, or I do like sticky boards with like Post-it notes, like tell us the one thing you're concerned about this week, right? So a lot of it is going to community events and doing interactive things that don't look like research. And also people can see the results, right? So if I say, put a dot next to the thing that you're most concerned about, then as people walk past, they can see that their community is most concerned about that thing. It's not collecting results and then hiding them. So I think there are other ways that we could do really interesting. The question is how then people go, oh, is that a rigorous research method? And I'm a qualitative researcher, so I will always say yes. But yes, I think we could do other things that would be much more part of the communities that we're trying to study rather than this parachuting approach and taking our methods into a community.
Yeah, thank you. I love it. Yeah, I like the sticky notes perspective because community members can immediately see, what the results look like, right? So how are their thoughts connected?
Exactly. And thank you for sharing that piece. This is great. I haven't seen this before, so I'm going to read this now.
Oh, thank you, Sarah. Okay. We have no more questions. Kate, do you have another question?
I just want to say thank you so much. As a nurse turned network and health impact strategist in higher ed, I am just all the neurons are ablaze with every component of your conversation. And I'm really inspired. So I look forward to reconnecting with you, Marcia, and learning more about the ways we can be pulling on all these strings as we create community that's got like a really authentic grassroots voice. So thank you so much, Claire, for the work you do.
Thank you for saying that.
Sarah, please.
Yeah, I was wondering if you had any, quick thoughts on have you started rephrasing or reframing how you think about misinformation? I know you mentioned it in the beginning, and I have to go look at the piece that you've written about misinformation is not really misinformation, but just being, unaware. Or have you reconsidered how you're going to reframe it in your future research?
Yeah, it's a great question because I think I have reframed it in my head and my methods. But in that piece, I taught, the very simple difference between mis and disinformation. So disinformation, somebody deliberately creating false information to cause harm. Misinformation, somebody doing it unwittingly, right? And so in my piece, I talk about like people that I would see in my anti-vax work, right, on Instagram, holding a binder full of research, academic research, with a T-shirt that says informed. Now, that woman there, she's not a disinformer. She's not deliberately creating false information to cause harm. She thinks vaccines are causing harm and she's preventing harm, right? Or the people that stormed the Capitol on January 6th, they thought they were protecting democracy, right? And so I was like, well, they're not disinformers and they're not misinformers who are just sharing something in the coffee shop without checking. And so I was like, by telling ourselves within this field that we had this very simple dichotomy and we just needed to think about intent, I don't think we recognize what it meant for many, many people to think about different forms of information as true or false from their own perspective. And I think it has, I don't think the field has helped itself by not recognizing these different ways of thinking. So, the term I coined in 2017, information disorder, I think I say that because I think we're in a disordered information environment where people are coming at information from very different perspectives, and it is not black and white. And we only understand this by, Craig going to that conference. He stood there and was told for 2 days that everything that his world believed in was misinformation, right? Like, what do we do with that? The terms aren't helping us. So yeah, it's a great, I haven't come back with a good answer, but I think differently about the problem. I just haven't come up with a good set of terms yet.
Thank you. I think even just recognizing that that there are many, many different shades to it is a helpful first place to start. Yeah.
Okay. So if we don't have any other questions, thank you again, Dr. Claire Wardle, and thank you everybody for joining our virtual lecture, and we hope to see you in our future series. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye. Bye. Have a nice day.